Hello. This is Scott Eustace for Gulf Restoration Network. In the next few minutes, I'm going to talk to you about Louisiana's coastal crisis, how we got to be in the situation we're in. The three main processes to think about as the problem and part of the solution, and whether or not they have been part of the solution, are the river, the dredge, and the drill. It's those three forces that led us to where we are now, as represented in this slide, which is the Magnolia oil field down in Plaquemines Parish. That is an oil rig in what used to be a marshland, now lattice with different oil canals. And we've also lost the marshes in between all of those oil canals. Up to 600 square miles of land since 1932. Where are we on the planet? Nowhere on the planet does such a powerful river like the Mississippi River empty into a gentle sea like the Gulf of Mexico. And that's why we get this protrusion of land into the Gulf we have in the past 7,000 years. In this slide, in this picture from NASA, you can easily imagine coastal Mississippi going right over to Texas, which would be the situation if we didn't have this river pouring into the Gulf of Mexico. You see here the giant sediment plumes flowing where the river is free in the Birdfoot Delta and the Atchafalaya Basin. That is sediment that historically would have built the delta over those 7,000 years, and it's now the river is constrained from building land in that manner. And here you get an idea of why that river has so much sediment, why it's so powerful. It drains 33 states and 2 Canadian provinces. It's an incredible, incredible system. And it's a fertile system. It is one of the most productive estuarine systems in the hemisphere, which are the most productive ecosystems on Earth due to the energy subsidies that come in the shallow water systems from the wind and the tide and the pulses of the river moving nutrients and organisms around. If you're an animal in an estuary, you don't have to spend a lot of energy moving because you can usually ride the tide. Your energy is subsidized by all of this mixing that's going on from the river, from the tide, and from the wind. And so we're in a very unique place. We have to practice conservation geology in Louisiana, not just conservation biology. There's a certain amount of natural building and natural erosion, but it happens on the scale of thousands of years. Here's a cartoon of what geologists call the St. Bernard Delta phenomenon from their cores down into the Sound. They theorize the river built out the land to the Chandeleur Islands, and we had solid marsh all the way to those islands 3,000 years ago. And naturally, there was some attenuation, but that process is a 1,000-year process as the river switched away toward the Lafourche Delta and then finally toward the Plaquemines Delta. And we've turned that 1,000-year process into a very rapid erosional process. And you look at, and that's the chronic problem, is that we stopped building. When you look at the percentage of what's actually causing the land loss, coastal erosion is a misnomer. About a quarter of the sediment a quarter of the land is being lost to erosion and not being replaced, but we have a much larger percentage that is due to the more proximate causes, the direct causes, the dredging of navigation canals, 5 to 6% across the coast, and then a third to 2/3 are from oil and gas canals and associated oil and gas activities. So we have a chronic problem, the river, more proximate problem, proximate causal loss, the dredging and the drilling. And of course, this problem is on the scale of 500 years. If we had levied off the river and only done this very slowly, we would have seen this kind of land loss because we failed to build and are subsiding. The solution that the state and the federal government have come up with is to reestablish the river into old oil fields using what's called a diversion channel. We prefer to call it a river restoration channel because this is what the river did naturally. It poured through small channels into the coastal marshes. In this graphic, you have an oil field. It used to be marshes, then became an oil field, then became open water as it is now around the Myrtle Grove Marina and Ironton area. That's the Alliance Refinery you see on the west bank. And that river goes through the picture, but there's also a branch of the river, artificially made channel. There's dedicated funding for this kind of river restoration. The Department of Justice ordered BP to pay into a fund that supplies up to $1.2 billion to Louisiana for river restoration and barrier islands to be administered by a national nonprofit organization. So this is very much a dedicated, funded type of restoration to solve our chronic problem, but we have a lot to solve, and so it's a necessary but only one part of the solution. When we talk about, so it's the river, the problem, the solution. We talk about the dredge, 5 to 6%, but that is a very important 5 to 6% for New Orleans, particularly because one of those large navigation channels is the Mr. Go. You can see here that purple-blue stripe from Breton Sound all the way up to the lower Ninth Ward marks the impact that it had directly on the environment, but it also had a lot of erosional impact and brought a lot of salt water into interior swamps in the lower Nine and just destroyed them. So it's a very dramatic 5 to 6% of the loss. Certainly there's no place more dramatic than the lower Ninth Ward for wetlands loss, where we have conversion of freshwater cypress tupelo swamp directly into open water. There's no intervening marsh stage. It's a very dramatic impact. Like as stated, there's not only the very large shipping channel direct impact, but the saltwater intrusion really happens, most of the saltwater intrusion that we discussed happens in relation to these 3 big channels across the Louisiana coast. There's about 12 federal channels, but there's really 3 very large ones. The Mr. Go, which is now deauthorized after Katrina and having destroyed New Orleans, the Houma Navigation Canal, and the Calcasieu Ship Channel out Lake Calcasieu from Lake Charles. And then there is an ecosystem restoration solution for these, just as for the river. The solution for the dredge of these large channels are these tidal restoration projects. And you can call it the largest Band-Aid in the world, but it is a necessary Band-Aid. It's part of the solution, along with river restoration and marsh creation. The Mr. Go is plugged ever since 2009. Congress told the Army Corps to plug it. They put a rock berm across it to prevent storm surge, but more importantly, to stop the everyday salt water. Since salt water travels along the bottom of the water, this rock berm stops it, and we've seen a freshening of the entire estuary, all the way up to Patsmanchac and Lake Maurepas, just from blocking this channel. So in the 6 years that we've had it blocked, it has restored the more natural tidal regime to the East Bank. The 2 other situations, we still have a much more active shipping activity. Houma Navigation Canal, there's been proposed a lock. Some of the money is dedicated to the Restore Council, the Federal Restore Council, dedicated directly to the state of Louisiana through the Restore Act, are being put toward this Houma Navigation Canal lock, which will restore the more appropriate tidal regime in Terrebonne Parish. And in Calcasieu and Cameron Parish, they no longer want a ship channel lock because of the gas export boom, but similar, the state is looking at restore monies to provide some salinity controls in that area, so you don't have the saltwater intrusion all the way up to Calcasieu Parish because of this deep draft shipping channel. So that's tidal restoration. It's very large. There's also the fact that the Army Corps was found to be liable for destroying large areas associated with the channel, not just the channel. So the Army Corps has a $3 billion plan to replace it. Congress has to date not authorized that money, and in fact, the Corps and the state are in a bit of a tussle over cost share. They're in a lawsuit. Either way, we, the citizens of Louisiana and the citizens of the United States, are going to pay for this restoration. So it doesn't seem like a big deal. It's all public money. It's all taxpayer dollars. We just wish it would happen soon because it needs to happen for the sake of New Orleans. The third process across the coast, and most significant, is the drill. Oil and gas is directly, indisputably responsible for 11% of the loss from 1932 to 1990, according to the USGS. Those impacts are still on the map. Those impacts are documented in canal permits. That's direct impact. So you get to the 36% number from 11% by adding in the alteration of hydrology from the spoil banks. Wetlands are required to be flooded sometime and drained some other part of the time. And there has to be a regular hydro period, flooding and draining of the land, or the land dies. The plants die, and when the plants die, the land disintegrates. Altering the hydrology with the spoil banks has led to damages up to 2 kilometers away from the canal itself. But there's also the fact that drilling operators, were very messy and salted the earth. They salted those salt marshes. And now, no plant likes salt. They just tolerate it. And you put too much brine, these drilling brines, which are also contaminated with oil and radioactive material, into the salt marshes. You kill the plants. You kill the plants, you've killed the marsh. And there's also some documentation of induced subsidence, just extracting fluid from under the earth causes the land to sink. Our Flood Authority East has now sued the oil and gas industry in order to effect restoration of the wetlands and provide maintenance funds for the levees for New Orleans. Otherwise, they say New Orleans is uninsurable. And this is a map of some of the canals, the direct impacts, crisscrossing our coast. Under the Coastal Management Act, oil and gas they shall restore these areas so that they are revegetated and detoxified. That's what the law says. If that suit ever gets to court, maybe we'll see some of that. USGS has documented some of these impacts of altered hydrology. They have in this map, which was produced in the year 2000 by Penland et al. For USGS, they say that there's some submergence due to altered hydrology in this gold color. And the altered hydrology related to oil and gas is that gold color. That accounts for up to 36%, well, another 20 or so percent on top of the 11, 25%, or up to 400,000 acres from 1932 to 1990 from the Atchafalaya Basin to the Mississippi border. And on the east bank, it's these areas around Delacroix, behind Delacroix, and in front of Braithwaite in the east bank, Plaquemines around White Ditch. And then you can see where the Myrtle Grove sediment diversion, that oil field in Plaquemines and Jefferson Parish in the Bayou DuPont area. Those black lines are the direct impact of oil and gas, and the gold is the indirect impact. There's also the fact that these facilities were messy, and it was, Kerry St. Pé was the first to really, the industry knew about the impacts of salt in the earth since at least the 50s, the impacts of these pits. These pits were recommended against by the EPA since the 1950s, but Louisiana regulators were not allowed to deny them until the Romer administration, when Kerry St. Pé and others were allowed to study the impacts, document them, and recommend that against these waste pits, against these waste storage practices that ended up destroying the marshes. These salt scars don't only exist on the coast, they're also in more northern parts of Louisiana. These remain on our landscape throughout the state today. So this was part of what oil and gas did to the coast, with loss of land through saltwater drilling waste. There's photographs of the canals. The indirect impacts to the hydrology extends 2 kilometers out, according to research done by G. Turner. And of course, in some limited hotspots, the USGS has documented that there's still marsh there in these old oil fields. It's just under the water. So that tells us it wasn't a surface impact. It wasn't pollution or altered hydrology killing the plants. It was something that happened under the marsh layer. It was increased subsidence. And what could cause subsidence of that magnitude in such a localized area? Only the induced subsidence of extracting fluid at high rates. So the oil industry is responsible there. That process has only been documented in about 4 places. It's because it's only been investigated in about 4 places across the Louisiana coast. But it results in this map you see before you with lots of black for the canals and lots of gold for oil and gas related submergence, and then the blue submergence, which is oil and gas mixed with other factors. So in Terrebonne Parish there, it's probably oil and gas submergence mixed with the altered hydrology from the Homan Navigation Canal. You see the purple areas are the erosion areas. So we have a lot of purple on the barrier islands and the exterior parts of the coast, as well as around the different lakes above Barataria Bay. But far and away, you see black and gold, oil and gas related impacts. But what have they done to fix it? Not much. We can fill these old oil fields with dredge material from the river. This is the EPA sponsored, federally funded Bayou DuPont restoration project. Right after Isaac, so you see the farmland to the right of these polygons of marsh is flooded. This is just after Isaac. We had so much rain. The refinery was flooded. This marsh weathered the storm. It's stuck tight. It can provide storm protection in a very quick way. It's very expensive, and we need oil and gas to fund this kind of project, like what's happening in, because these are old oil fields. The only reason there's water in the bottom of that photograph is because oil was extracted out of this area. Those canals through those polygons of marsh are old oil channels, like we saw in the first slide. The industry is responsible, and they're responsible for the issue that ultimately will determine how much land is left in Louisiana. Sea level rise is more important than any other factor in determining how much of Louisiana is left in 2061. We have a conflict. The state of Louisiana wants to fund all these restoration projects with revenue from the offshore Gulf oil fields, but promoting that drilling causes us to lose land more than anything else. And this is not talked about well in the state master plan. You have to squint, turn your head, and manipulate some graphs in order to see it, but it's there. Sea level rise, especially after it accelerates around, it's projected to accelerate in 2040 or so, will be what determines how much land is left. So regulating carbon has more of an impact than the Coastal Restoration Program. Here in the State Master Plan is how that's talked about. We have the moderate scenario, which basically involves regulating carbon, leaving fossil fuels in the ground. That's the only thing that's going to give us moderate sea level rise. And we have a less optimistic scenario, which is not even the worst case sea level rise, but a moderate amount of sea level rise. The state has run models with the so-called high-end scenario, but it doesn't produce those numbers or graphs for the public. What we're left with is just the more rosy scenarios. And what I've tried to illustrate in this graph, I've tried to rectify the axes so that you see what the impacts are of not acting with the restoration program versus acting in a very aggressive manner with lots of river restoration. So in the graph on the right, you see at the bottom of the graph, future without action. If we do nothing and let the coast continue to disintegrate, to not using diversions and only doing marsh creation, to improving that land result with a few small diversions, or do we really use the river to its fullest potential to maximize what we can do? Now, if we fail to regulate carbon and maximize the land, which is what this yellow scenario is showing us, that number lands around 42,000 square miles of land left, as opposed to the 5,000 we have now. If we regulate carbon, which is the green scenario, we end up much closer to that 5,000 number. We're able to run and stay in place. And the difference between all the controversy is around using the river. And it just seems that, this chart lays out that the impact of the restoration program is not as much as the impact as regulating carbon would have. You can see that the maximizing land scenario is above the future without action scenario if we regulated carbon. But the degree to which regulating carbon changes how much land we have at the end of 50 years is larger than any particular strategy for coastal restoration. The CPRA will argue that loss of land results in the loss of our coastal communities. And that's why we need to act with the restoration program. We need to spend monies, and we agree with that. We just think the oil and gas industry needs to step up and play its part. We think that's what would be just, considering it's that industry that has led to the crisis in the first place and aggravates it with sea level rise. The problem is that the state will not define a role for the oil and gas industry. Our levee authority has sued because they cannot do their job. They said that New Orleans is uninsurable in the next go-round, the next 15 years, if oil and gas doesn't pay up for their share of that $20 billion that the state has laid out for marsh creation in this $50 billion master plan. Most or all of the pipeline marsh creation is simply the restoration of old oil fields that were destroyed by industry activity. So that Bayou DuPont photograph I showed, the Lake Hermitage project with the Magnolia oil field, most of the places where we have these shallow water land loss in the interior areas are old oil fields, and those are the areas that we were proposing to spend $20 billion. Just where does that $20 billion come from? Is it going to come from Congress? Or is it going to come from the industry that destroyed the marshes in the first place? What would be just? There's also, when we speak about justice and environmental justice, there's a lack of urgency on the part of the state and federal government on land use planning and resilience. Even when we get them, levee projects take decades, are not maintainable, as we're seeing with New Orleans. They take decades, as we're seeing with Terrebonne and the Houma levee. So we need monies put toward planning and moving people, or helping them recover, flood-proofing their homes now, in 2015. We needed it in 2005, honestly. Some of the ideas we've heard from coastal communities are as follows: something like a resilience trust fund. We need some of these Restore Act dollars to go into a fund where we take off the interest for supplying bivouacs for supplies like water or appliances that people want to rebuild their homes after a storm. There should be a relocation trust fund that kicks in right after a storm from the state or federal monies. So we don't know where exactly the storm is going to hit, but it's going to hit somewhere on the coast. So we need to be prepared with funding. FEMA, the state is relying on FEMA to be funded, and it may not be there. We need some other dedicated trust fund for dealing with Louisiana's crisis, and the crisis that people are leaving. We'd rather that they leave in a controlled manner than an uncontrolled one. So let's fund it. Let's have a trust fund. Even when we get the levees, certain communities are flooded by them. Ilges and Charles in Terrebonne Parish is flooded out by the Morganza to the Gulf levee around Houma. This is a flood protection project. That puts more water into that community. That community needs to be relocated. That community has sought funding to be relocated, and the Corps has said that funding will not be released until 2035 as part of the authorized levee project. The storm comes, we're going to see so many storms before 2035. Is there going to be anyone left to move in 2035? It's very cynical on the part of the state and federal government, and it is unjust. When we do see these monies provided, for example, home elevation grants after Katrina to help people deal with floods, there was a lot of corruption and not a lot of safeguards against price gouging or just taking the grant money and leaving the country, basically. Those home elevation grants did not have enough. There wasn't enough regulation of companies receiving the grants after Katrina. It led to a lot of problems, including my father didn't elevate the home in Lakeview because he didn't want to deal with the scams. Then there's a problem that the state needs to get ahead of land use planning and think about where coastal communities can relocate to and preserve their culture. Ilses and Charles wants to be relocated to a place where they can maintain their native lifeway, can maintain their relationship with the land, with fishing. But the real estate problems are manifest. The good places will probably not be available to poor communities, to black communities, Native American communities that are discriminated against in the real estate industry. So we really need to do explicit relocation planning of coastal communities, otherwise we will lose our way of life on the coast. We put all these pretty pictures on all the government planning documents, but we need a lot more behind it. And having clear title to the land is a problem in African American communities, freedom towns up and down the river. People freed themselves, formed towns, but never got clear title to the land, so they've just been living there for hundreds of years without title which gives you access to federal resources in the wake of a disaster. There's also in the Native American communities problems with access to clear title for religious reasons, for spiritual reasons. People don't feel like they can own a document, that they can have a document that says they own a particular parcel, or just the fact that people were fleeing persecution at the time and had and didn't want any documentation that they lived on the land for some periods of history. And these impact the access to federal and state resources today. But we're not the only ones dealing with this crisis. Seth Tabachman graciously drew this and provided this graphic for us. This is really the politics of the 21st century, and Louisiana gets to experience it first. So thank you for listening.